Hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset podcast with me, Sam Webster Harris, diving into the psychology of self-improvement with a curious mind and a cynical lens towards common self-improvement advice. Today, we are uncovering the wonderful world of ideas and excavating some lessons from the greatest thinkers and doers who ever lived, and separating the practices that we can replicate and the ones that we really can't. I'm going to launch off today with a bit of an analogy. When you think about a plane, the hardest moments during any journey are when it switches between modes of transport. Most of the time, it is a land-based monolith with its weight supported by its wheels. However, it needs to change into becoming a bird of the skies, and that requires a large burst of activation energy where it changes to having its weight carried by the lift of its wings. The journey itself can also be kind of difficult, requires a fair amount of skill to keep it guided nicely, and a lot of fuel and energy to sustain the whole flying thing. But most importantly, the plane needs to transfer back into being a land creature again, if anybody wants to get off and benefit from having gone on the journey. And it's surprisingly similar to having innovative ideas. We can't just navigate the world of ideas with our feet on the floor, exploring the spaces where everything is known. We have to be bold and burst out of the normal lines of thinking and let our ideation take flight. That means suspending belief, going to weird places that don't currently make sense but might do on the other side. Einstein suspended the current rules of physics to invent new rules. Darwin shook up all that was known about biology and religion to invent a new history of how species and humans were created. And much less dramatically, even when you're writing, whether a blog, newsletter, or a podcast, for example, it requires you to imagine something new and work at it. An initial idea is completely worthless sat in our brain. It's like a plane on tarmac. It has to take flight and break out of us. That requires some initial activation energy to embark on a project which is hard. Trying to build a business or having an invention isn't as easy as just having the initial idea. Einstein had to find a job that gave him free time where he could wield numbers and logic into written ideas that other people could understand. Darwin had to document the movements, traits, histories of many different species over decades to put all his work together. And again, much less impressively, I actually have to put some time into writing this episode. And sadly, if I just take a walk and think deeply, it doesn't quite cut it. And so whatever you're doing, you are going to have to dedicate time and resources to get an idea going. And then we come to the flying. This is where the fun begins. Once you've departed from the solid floor of known concepts and start wrestling with an idea, to see where the idea will go, you do have to guide it and sustain it responsibly. If you don't work at it and push it to reach its final destination of a completed idea, it kind of just drops from the sky and you get back to normal reality. A half-written book is 0 books. A new business plan is 0 businesses. Even a new cake recipe is 0 cakes. Naval Ravikant has a really good quote. He says that every idea has already been thought of probably. The only way you're going to find something out is if you stick to it at an irrational level and try a whole bunch of things. Ideas are a commodity. Execution is what is incredibly rare. Are you willing to put in the unreasonable amount of time and effort to make it happen? And if you think about it, Steve Jobs wasn't a genius with his idea to build a smartphone. No, plenty of people had the idea before him to build a smartphone. Steve Jobs was a genius in his approach. He had a really high bar for the design. He understood the manufacturing tolerances to get it made. He didn't care about the initial financial outcome. He was willing to do whatever it needed to make it work and work well. And he was able to rally all the people to get it done and just obsessed over the details and enforcing it to be so simple and so usable. He was the unreasonable person who went further than anybody else to make a smartphone that was actually good. And when we hear that, it might sound daunting and like we need to know exactly where we're going, but Steve Jobs just had a good intuition of what was right and wrong. He didn't know what the final product would be when he first started it. And this is really just part of the journey. We have to start working on ideas and accept that they change along the way. I've never sat down to craft a single one of my ideas in my life where I didn't have new ideas along the way of how to change it, whether that's writing a song, drawing a picture, starting a business, or writing an episode. Even the whole concept of this podcast has changed a lot since I started it 7 years ago. But that's great. I frequently have fascinating and unexpected discoveries along the way, which is what makes it more interesting. And I'm certainly not unique here. When Mr. Beast began YouTubing, Squid Games didn't exist, but the idea for his most popular video ever only happened because he'd already spent years getting better at YouTube and had a platform for making grand competition-style videos. In fact, for the first few years of Mr. Beast's career, he mostly just made videos of himself playing computer games that no one watched. We could also look at Jeff Bezos. He had no interest at all in web servers when he started Amazon, but he had to invest a lot of money into server infrastructure to grow the Amazon.com website. And whilst he did that, it gave him the idea to build what is now the incredibly profitable Amazon Web Services, where they provide server infrastructure for anyone who wants to use it. And that business has a current income of $100 billion a year, which is really not that shabby for just a side quest idea on the way. So the very important lessons here are to just start doing things, build momentum whilst staying open to new lessons. If you heard of the origin story of Twitch, that company started with one dude live streaming his entire life and eventually pivoted into what is now the biggest platform for live streaming games. And the founders had no idea what it was going to become. They learned what people would watch and they built more features for what was working. And I realize it might sound like you only have to have giant ideas from the examples I'm giving, but this is also fine for all the simple things like what you might have for dinner, going on holiday, changing your kitchen design. You just have to start having ideas, putting them out there, working on them, and they are guaranteed to change and improve as long as you are the guide for where they are going, and then most importantly, that you start to learn landing them. Now, a pilot who can't land a plane is not a good pilot. By far, the most important part of improving at anything is becoming a completer. And it's worth noting that even a completed book draft isn't a published book. We need to bring all the pieces together and not only make them understandable, but also accessible and distributable to our audience. Darwin had to publish The Origin of Species. Mozart had to perform his first symphony. Steve Jobs had to launch the iPhone. And this does mean overcoming our desire for perfection and our fears of judgment and just getting something out there. It's always very tempting to rewrite another book draft, to iterate on our logo design, rethink our titles, change a recipe, whatever. But your truly best work comes from repetition and feedback. And this is a staple lesson of the growth mindset. You can't just be brilliant in your own world. You have to get feedback. That means getting your ideas out there into the hands of users, readers, eaters, contemporaries. Doesn't matter. Just getting feedback on it, seeing what's working, what doesn't work, tweaking things, starting again. Mark Manson, James Clear, Morgan Housel, they all wrote consistent blogs for years and years whilst picking up on what resonated with their audiences, and they honed their craft, they learned what worked, and from that, they created 3 of the best-selling books of the last decade. Similarly, Van Gogh painted obsessively for years, and we think of him as this isolated painter, but his brother was an art collector who saw nearly every single one of Van Gogh's work and gave feedback. And Van Gogh did hang out with a lot of contemporaries and spent a lot of time with Paul Gauguin, for example, learning from each other. And sure, Van Gogh's early work was good, but it would probably have been forgotten if it wasn't for the forms of expression he later developed. And then we have perhaps my favorite example, Napoleon. He forged his career by leading ragtag collections of men against bigger and bigger forces as his power slowly grew because he kept on winning. And by the time he came to the Battle of Austerlitz, he was already a very well recognized hero of France. Now, he was facing the armies of both Russia and Austria, and he was outnumbered, and the situation looked very clear like France should lose. But Napoleon won what is considered one of the greatest military battles in history, because he was already Napoleon, the hero of France, and his men could believe in him enough to try some really daring tactics that happened to work out perfectly and turned Napoleon into the dictator of Europe and a legend of history. A good pilot is not defined by one flight, but by their career. It's easy to think about those who lead revolutionary change as brilliant thinkers who are just obsessed with their ideas. And we forget that they are great executors. They showed up and delivered consistently time after time after time. And they often did this long before they started the thing we even remembered them for. As the saying goes, it takes 20 years to make an overnight success. Innovators, they don't just venture into bizarre places to think radically. They do put dedicated time and effort into navigating their idea through its journey. As it changes and develops along the way, they carefully control its final descent into its finished form, where it can then rest in public acceptance without any further work needed from them to sustain it. And it's a process. They force the initial weird ideas out of their brain onto paper, and then they work it into reality, and they do it again and again and again. Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA, says that it is amateurs who have one big, bright, beautiful idea that they can never abandon. Professionals know they have to produce theory after theory before they're likely to hit the jackpot. And it's so natural for us to just fall into the trap of thinking we should wait to have the perfect idea before we risk trying something or it failing. It's a myth, and it's genuinely very destructive to actually getting something done in your life. Ultimately, we need to learn the ropes of having ideas, piloting them, and completing them. We need to do it consistently long before we'll really have our biggest ideas. Steve Jobs had built Apple, the iPod. He'd helped found Pixar before his most memorable achievement of inventing the iPhone that he didn't even invent. Edison, for example, had hundreds of patents before he invented the lightbulb, which is the thing he's most famous for. In fact, Edison even created the first ever recorded and played back sound in 1877. That was the year before he invented the light bulb. And what's nuts is that it took until about 1910 before recorded music started to become accessible to humans. And just when I think about that, it always feels so crazy to me that humanity has only had the ability to listen to recorded voices and music for a little over 100 years. In the time of Mozart, even 100 years earlier, you had to be at a concert if you ever wanted to hear music. And I just find it so hard to imagine a world where you can't listen to music. Anyway, that was a random side note. On the subject of side notes, Edison also didn't invent the light bulb as such, as I think about 10 people had invented light bulbs before him, but he made the first usable, mass-producible one that would last quite a long time. Right. Now let's talk about where this leads us into the next topic, which is destiny. If you think of an expert marble sculptor, they can turn a square block of marble into an incredible depiction of the face of Alexander, the hand of God. If they really wish, they could turn it into a penis, which they seem to do frequently. But if you think of an inexperienced carver, they'll likely just make an incoherent mess of anything and often seem to end up creating curiously wonky penises. Anyway, penises aside, the trillions of atoms in the marble block could take any shape. It has no real destiny besides that of the skill level, tools, and current inspiration of the carver, which perhaps is little wonder why there are so many penises immortalized in marble from history. Anyway, I said I was going to stop talking about that, so concentrating. The point here is that it's easy to look at someone's incredible life and think that it was their destiny to be that way, that Einstein or Alexander the Great would always do that thing that we remember them for. And that's like saying a chunk of marble was born to become the face of Alexander. It's kind of an offense to the artist. In reality, someone's life is a result of their skills, tools, current inspirations, and the environment of their times. Einstein, born today, might not even study physics. Perhaps he'd pursue philosophy, music, which are kind of the obvious ideas from other interests in his life, but maybe he'd pursue a career in sailing. Who knows? It's certainly pretty obvious that Alexander the Great wouldn't be uniting Macedonia to invade Persia and India, and Christopher Columbus wouldn't be discovering America. And when we think about this, it's obvious that we can learn lessons from these great people, but we can't replicate their exact process to have impactful ideas when we live in a very different environment with different tools, and each of us likely have different skills and interests. What we can do is we can look at the bigger fundamental truths and commit to taking action to getting our ideas out there, exploring the unknown with an open mind, and then making ourselves come back down to earth with something concrete, even if it isn't perfect. So, of course, I wish you a safe flight with your ideas. Now we're going to move on after the break. Now we're going to have a few notes on some other side quests that relate to the topics that we've been speaking about. Firstly, is your life an idea? I mean, think about it. Napoleon isn't defined by one battle won or lost, and he's not defined by one saucy letter to Josephine. He's actually a concept driven along by the actions of others who make movies about him or talk about him on their podcasts. And so when we think about our life story as, well, the meta idea of our whole existence, the journey it takes is kind of a flight path fueled along by the ideas and actions that we take every day. The trail across the sky in the wake of your actions that thrust you along. And just like those trails across the sky after a plane, our actions fade away over time. Napoleon's army of 500,000 men waded into Russia with their guns blazing, and they slowly froze and starved to death as they plundered anything they could in their wake, until they eventually reached Moscow. A few weeks later, they had to retreat all the way back, which was a bit pointless, and only 10% of them even managed to reach Europe alive. And despite this being a huge ordeal that caused a multitude of personal trauma along the way and land scars, but, it faded. It moved the legend of Napoleon along, but the actions fade and those people who were affected dissolve into history. And when you think about it, it's only the really good stories or useful ideas that stick around if they are worth keeping, like Pythagoras' triangle, because it works. The Sistine Chapel is still around because it is beautiful. And even the month of July is still named after Julius Caesar because we haven't really invented a better calendar. So we've got it, and good for him. Another interesting random idea I have is the concept of tragedy. A great way to land the plane of your life is if you happen to have a very tragic ending. If you have your troubles wrapped into your art and life story and you end up dying like Amy Winehouse or Van Gogh, it adds to the legend. Or would Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, or Joan of Arc be as famous if it wasn't for their assassinations? When you die for your principles, that's very, very notable. Would there even be a record of Socrates' teachings if he hadn't died for his principles in such a dramatic and story-worthy style? And of course, perhaps most famously of all those people who died in their prime was Mr. Jesus, who was certainly a rock star of his time and for the last 2,000 years. Anyway, you probably don't want to be Jesus, at least not in the way that he died. And you likely don't feel like dying just to make a point. So this isn't very actionable life advice, and I certainly do not approve of suicide. And we'll just move on to another burning question I have, which is, why do Greek statues have tiny penises? I mean, really, it does make you wonder if some of these people who've been immortalized forever were a bit annoyed at the artistic minimization of their package. Well, there is an answer. It turns out, in the society of Greece, being lustful and erect was super lame. It indicated that you were like a low-key douche, and artistically being given a large package was kind of like the male version of slut-shaming and showing everyone that you were an idiot that couldn't actually think about sensible things because you were just too busy thinking about sex and were just a bit of a cretin. In fact, the smaller your package, the more virtuous and great person you were. So if you've ever wondered why the statue of David has such a microscopic endowment, well, that was actually artistic license to make him look more manly and have people comment things like, "What a guy, woof," which does seem unintuitive these days, but hey, that is the way trends and society change. Okay, thank you for listening to the show and the ideas in psychology and beyond that interest me. I am delighted to announce that the show is currently #1 in Albania and the Philippines this week, which is bonkers. So shout out to all the Albanians and Filipino listeners, you're legends, and everybody do please keep sharing and or rating the show as it makes a big difference. Now, remember, life is too short for not investigating the odd ideas we have, so good luck making them happen consistently and breaking them out of your mind and into reality. And of course, don't forget to smile at strangers. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
Studies show we need time for information to sink in, so I'm going to give you a 5-second pause, silence, to reflect on one idea from the show before you jump back into your busy life. Ready and go.